For thousands of years, the silence surrounding Saturn had been absolute, a majestic, icy communion between the ringed giant and the void. Occasionally, a human research vessel or a cobalt mining tug would pierce the velvet dark, their thrusters mere fireflies against the planet's gas giant scale. But on this day, the silence wasn't just broken. It was shattered, torn to shreds, and ground into nothingness. Space itself seemed to scream as it rucked and folded. The serene tapestry of stars above the F-ring ripped open, not once, but in a rapid, terrifying cascade of reality-bending detonations. Hundreds of pinpricks of violet light blossomed, expanding into swirling vortices before vomiting forth shapes of nightmare and steel. The great dark void was instantly choked. 240 warships of the Tharvex Empire materialized in tight, predatory formation, their hull plates absorbing the pale sunlight and casting a shadow so vast they obscured the stars, closing off the sky like an approaching wall of iron. They were brutal, predatory designs, all sharp angles, weapon blisters, and engines burning with the sickly green heat of antimatter. Even from millions of miles away, the raw gravitational wake of their displacement shivered through the solar system, registered by every buoy, station, and outpost from Mercury to the Oort cloud. It was an invasion force not meant to conquer a system, but to crush a bug. Before the first panicked report could even be processed by Unified Earth Defense Command, the ultimatum arrived. It didn't come via a polite diplomatic frequency. It slammed into every open channel, broadcast on a tight beam laser that overpowered all civilian and military bands, converting instantly into every dominant human language. The image that flashed onto screens from the high-rises of Manhattan to the biodomes of Mars was one of cold, alien arrogance. High Marshal Tharvex Sorn looked less like a soldier and more like a high priest of destruction. His face, a landscape of pale, scarified flesh. His eyes, twin voids beneath a heavy, ornate browpiece. "Cattle of Saul," Sorn's voice grated, the translation software struggling with the sheer guttural contempt of his natural tongue. "You have existed in the darkness of your own ignorance for long enough. We are the Tharvex, lords of the Sagittarius arm. Your period of chaotic self-rule is terminated. You have exactly 10 local days to transmit codes of unconditional surrender. You will relinquish all spaceborne assets, surrender control of all planetary resources, and categorize your population for labor assessment. Failure to comply within the allotted 10-day window will result in the immediate systematic, kinetic adjustment of your primary inhabited biomes. The choice is yours: serve or become dust." The transmission cut as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the horrifying silence of space and the terrifying reality of those 240 dreadnoughts hanging over the solar system's crown. Then, Earth miraculously. A collective scream broke across the planet. Global communications media didn't just crash, it went nuclear. The carefully constructed facade of 22nd century stability evaporated in microseconds. Panic, pure and primal, surged through every city. Currencies collapsed on the spot. Governments, previously united under the loose banner of the United Nations, instantly fractured. Deep-seated rivalries, dormant for 50 years, re-emerged as leaders looked to their own defenses. Some emergency cabinets immediately began drafting terms of capitulation, citing the obvious futility of resistance. Others called for suicidal nuclear defiance, while a terrified public scrambled for shelters that didn't exist, forced into the agonizing realization that humanity was not the master of its fate, but merely a non-threatening anomaly that a mature empire had finally decided to correct. Yet, amid the screaming static of a civilization tearing itself apart, the true war had already begun in the silent dark. 70 astronomical units from Saturn, nestled in the eternal twilight of the Kuiper Belt, sat an uncharted speck of dust designated Supply Depot Sentinel-4. To anyone looking, it was an obsolete relic, a refueling stop for deep-range scouts that had been decommissioned 20 years ago. In reality, it was something very different. And Stellan Rook was a very different kind of commander. At 36, Stellan bore the quiet, weary stillness of a man who had already seen his world end once. He was the sole survivor of the infamous Radiance incident above Jupiter a decade prior, where a failure in a civilian ark's shielding had turned thousands into ash while he watched, helpless, from a nearby patrol ship. That failure had burned away his youthful arrogance, leaving behind something harder, sharper, and infinitely more responsible. His face was a map of focused intent, his movements precise as he stood in the dim, red-lit confines of Sentinel-4's clandestine command center. He hadn't been listening to the ultimatum. While the rest of the system panicked over the what, Stellan had been dissecting the how. "Commander," said Lieutenant Eva Rostova, her voice clipped but vibrating with tension. She was feeding the massive amounts of data from the initial Tharvex FTL arrival into their quantum correlation engine. "The fleet signature is verified. 240 vessels. Main power cores are off the charts. We have nothing in the inventory that can dent their plating, let alone their energy shields." "I know what they are, Ava," Stellan murmured. His eyes locked on a scrolling waterfall of raw telemetry. "Show me the packet data from their ultimatum transmission, not the video. The carrier wave metadata." She frowned, her fingers flying over the holographic interface, pulling up the deep layer analysis. Stellan leaned closer. There, hidden deep within the signal noise, was the handshake trace from their initial scanning arrays, a digital fingerprint left behind when they first cataloged the system's frequencies. Stellan stared at the code. His eyes narrowed. "Rostova, look at that timestamp sequence. It doesn't match a long-term surveillance pattern. Run it against the Galactic standard dating algorithm." She did, and her breath caught. My God. The handshake code. It's less than 2 standard cycles old. "Commander, that means they've only been actively monitoring us for less than 18 months. Stellan pulled back, a cold, hard smile touching his lips for the first time. The terror didn't leave him, but it was joined by a ferocious clarity. The realization hit him like a kinetic round. The Tharvex were arrogant, but they were also negligent. They hadn't done their homework. "They looked at us," Stellan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And they saw exactly what we wanted them to see. They saw the infighting on Earth. They saw our patrol ships, our outdated ion drives, our noisy, inefficient radio communications. They counted our missiles and measured our industrial output and concluded we are a noisy, primitive species that only recently learned how to leave our own atmosphere. They only see the noisy surface of humanity." He looked up at the command holo, at the horrifying wall of alien warships. "But they don't know about the silence. They have no idea what we've been building in the dark." He tapped the quantum communication link. He didn't have to wait. The channel was already open, waiting for him. Deep beneath Geneva, in a bunker designed to survive a planetary-scale impact, UN Secretary-General Lenora Quill looked at the decryption confirmation on her own screen. Her face, usually a masterpiece of diplomatic composure, was pale, but her eyes held the same terrible resolve as Stellan's. Around her, the highest-ranking military minds of Earth were either in despair or shouting arguments for surrender. Quill looked at the decrypted message from Sentinel-4. It was just a single word: confirm. She took a breath that felt like breathing in glass. Humanity had spent 70 years pretending to be weak, pretending to be a non-threat to a galaxy they knew was predatory, all while preparing for this exact moment. The deception had been agonizing, costly, and near absolute. With a precise movement, she reached for a biometric scanner and placed her palm on the cold glass. She looked at her Joint Chiefs. "The time for pretense is over." She spoke a single command: "Activate the long silence protocol." 7 billion miles away. Stellan Rook felt his console vibrate as a new, high-priority command code flushed red across his display. It was an order he had trained for but hoped would never come. He looked out the small viewport, into the endless black of the Kuiper Belt, knowing his time in the shadows was over. "Lieutenant," he said, turning back to Rostova, "engage the active sensor ghosts. I want every buoy from here to Pluto radiating garbage data. Mask our true signature." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier now that she had orders. "Where are we going?" "We're leaving the belt. We need to meet them," Stellan said. He looked back at the strategic hollow, at the overwhelming odds. His mission wasn't to win. Not yet. "Our orders are very specific. Eva. We aren't going in to beat them. Not yet. We have exactly 10 days to put on the performance of our lives. We need to make Dravik Sorn believe that those 240 ships are, indeed, an unstoppable force, and that Earth's pathetic, fractured defense fleet is the very best we have to offer. We have to make them believe what they see." The scene shifted, zooming in across billions of miles of space to the heart of the Tharvex Armada, into the panoramic observation bay of the Throne of Cinders. The Imperial flagship. High Marshal Dravik Sorn stood with his arms crossed over his armored chest, his predatory eyes scanning the pale blue dot far in the distance. Below him, the tactical displays showed a system in freefall. Earth's media was in a chaotic frenzy of terror. Their military was scattering in disorganized retreat. Their governments were bickering. It was all so predictable. It was pathetic. He watched the data streams, seeing the fear of a civilization realizing its end was nigh. He had broken 1,000 worlds like this one. Humanity was just another footnote. He felt the cold pull of contempt, a predatory satisfaction. These primitives would be good for labor, but their spirit would be easy to crush. Dravik mim koikin meet. This would not be a war. It would be a correction. A simple kinetic adjustment to tidy up the Sagittarius arm. Back on Sentinel-4. Stellan Rook watched the strategic displays, seeing the same image of the massive alien armada poised to strike. But he didn't feel the same despair as the rest of his species. He saw the flaws now. He saw their overconfidence. He saw the ticking clock of their ignorance. He only looked at the screen and said softly, to the only other person in the system who understood the terrifying truth. "They came sooner than expected. Dravik. But you are still too late to understand us." The air inside the subterranean strategic vault, buried nearly 2,000 feet beneath the bedrock of Geneva, felt as heavy as the stone above it. The environmental scrubbers hummed a steady, monotonous drone, yet they utterly failed to filter out the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat and rising panic. Around the massive obsidian table sat the 50 highest-ranking leaders of the Unified Earth Council. Most of them looked like they had aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. "It is statistical suicide," Defense Minister Kalin shouted, slamming a fist onto the table. His holographic displays flared with red threat metrics. "We are looking at 240 interstellar dreadnoughts. Our deep space defense grid is a joke compared to that mass. If we do not open a dialogue and offer a negotiated surrender of the outer colonies, they will crack this planet like a glass marble. We have absolutely no chance of matching a galactic empire in a conventional war." Secretary General Lenora Quill let the echo of Kalin's desperation fade into the thick silence of the room. She stood at the head of the table, her posture rigidly perfect, her expression carved from frost. She did not look at Kalin. She looked through him. "There is no dialogue to be had, Minister," Quill stated, her voice slicing through the heavy atmosphere. "You do not negotiate with a boot when you are the ant. They did not come to parley. They came to harvest." She reached out and placed her hand flat against the center console. The ambient lights in the vault shifted from stark white to a deep, tactical crimson. The heavy blast doors sealed with a deafening, final thud. "I am overriding Standard Council protocols," Quill announced. "Level Omega clearance is now in effect. For over half a century, since the first undeniable proof of hostile interstellar traffic was detected, this office has operated under a singular, terrifying assumption. We knew we could never outbuild an established empire in a straight arms race. If we built a massive military armada, any watching eye would see it, classify us as a threat, and wipe us out before we could launch a single vessel." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the council. Kalen frowned, his anger giving way to bewilderment. "What are you saying, Secretary General? We know our fleet strength. It is woefully inadequate." "You know the fleet strength you were permitted to see," Quill corrected him softly. "You see civilian infrastructure. You see deep-core mining conglomerates, automated salvage yards, and the massive migration arcs pushing out toward the Oort cloud. You see a decentralized, chaotic civilian expansion." She stepped back as the center of the obsidian table dissolved into a massive, three-dimensional projection of the solar system. "What you are actually looking at is the logistical backbone of a decentralized distributed war machine." A blue light flickered at the edge of the projection, resolving into the life-sized, holographic avatar of Commander Stellan Rook. The harsh red lighting of his own distant command center painted sharp shadows across his weary, resolute face. "The Secretary General is correct." Stellan's voice filled the room, transmitted securely across billions of miles of empty space. "We did not build a secret fleet. A secret fleet is a singular target. Instead, we built a war survival paradigm. Every heavy-duty mining laser on the Ceres belt is calibrated to scale up to armor-piercing output. Every salvage tug in the Jovian Shadow is retrofitted with hardened kinetic shielding. Our civilian infrastructure is our military." The council members stared at the hologram in stunned silence. Kalen shook his head slowly. "Even if that is true, Commander, modified mining ships cannot go toe-to-toe with Imperial dreadnoughts." "They do not have to," Stellan replied, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. "They only need to support the true assets. Over the past 40 years, we have pushed massive, self-sustaining industrial clusters into the dark zones at the very edge of the solar system. We call them the Steel Pilgrims. They are mobile, city-sized foundries and drone-swarming hubs. They are the real army." A profound silence settled over the room as the sheer scale of the deception sank in. Humanity had spent generations turning its own perimeter into a dormant weapon, hiding a military-industrial complex behind the guise of a struggling frontier. "Then, what are we waiting for?" demanded the Minister of Intelligence, her eyes wide with sudden, frantic hope. "Recall them! Broadcast their signatures! If the enemy commander sees the true scale of our industry, if we threaten them with the Pilgrims, they might realize we are too costly to conquer. We can use this as absolute deterrence." "No," Stellan countered instantly, the word cracking like a whip. "If you reveal the Pilgrims now, you will kill us all." The intelligence minister bristled. "Commander, keeping this hidden while they prepare to fire is madness." "It is strategy," Stellan corrected, his eyes locking onto the minister's projection. "Deterrence only works on an enemy that respects your right to exist. The Tharvex do not. If we show our full hand right now, they will not retreat. They will simply change their tactical doctrine. They will scatter, bypass Earth, and hunt down the Pilgrims one by one before those foundries can fully transition to war footing. The Pilgrims are massive, but they are deep in the outer dark. They need time to reconfigure, fuel, and coordinate their return vectors. Time is the one resource we cannot manufacture, and right now, it is more precious than 1,000 dreadnoughts." Quill stepped forward, seamlessly aligning herself with Stellan's brutal logic. "The commander is right. We cannot scare them away. We can only trap them. But to trap them, they must remain absolutely convinced of their own superiority. They must believe that our surface-level panic is genuine. "But the public," Kalen protested, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "The riots, the despair." "If we do not give them hope, the population will tear itself apart before the Empire fires a single shot. And history will remember us as monsters who stood by and watched." "Then let history judge me," Quill said, her voice dropping to a register of chilling absolute authority. "I am not here to manage public relations. I am here to ensure the human race survives the next 2 months. I will accept the hatred of 7 billion people if it keeps them breathing." Stellan watched Quill, a profound, silent respect passing between them. They were two halves of a terrible equation. She would hold the fractured planet together through the sheer force of her will, while he orchestrated a symphony of calculated losses in the dark. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior, the phrase "calculated losses" tore at something deep and unhealed within Stellan's chest. His mind violently dragged him back 8 years to the Radiance incident. He felt the phantom heat of the Jupiter flare. He heard the chaotic, screaming radio traffic of the civilian Ark as its shields failed, boiling 3,000 colonists alive while he sat helpless in his patrol craft, bound by orders not to break position and reveal his ship's advanced dampening capabilities. He had bought secrecy with their lives then. He was about to do it again, but on a scale that defied comprehension. The metallic taste of guilt flooded his mouth. Asking men and women to hold a line they were designed to lose, to bleed simply to buy hours on a clock, went against every protective instinct he possessed. He forced the ghost of the Ark back down into the dark corners of his mind. The present required a monster, not a savior. "We must feed their arrogance." Stellan addressed the council, his voice completely hollowed out of emotion. "The enemy expects a desperate, disorganized defense from a primitive world. We will give them exactly that." "What are your parameters, Commander?" Quill asked, leaning slightly forward. "We do not throw our entire hidden reserve at them." Stellan outlined, his tactical overlay drawing a slender, fragile line across the orbit of Saturn's moons. "I will assemble a vanguard. We will put together a defense fleet that looks exactly like the absolute maximum effort a desperate, young civilization could muster. It will be large enough to be annoying, heavily armed enough to be considered a minor, legitimate threat, but ultimately small enough to be misjudged as our entire planetary defense force." Kalen swallowed hard, realizing what Stellan was truly saying. "You are going to send them out there just to die." "I am going to send them out there to fight like hell," Stellan corrected quietly. "They will bleed the Empire's vanguard. They will force the enemy to commit their formations, to lock into a specific engagement vector, and to waste their time swatting at flies while the real hammer is drawn back in the dark." Stellan looked directly at Quill, the shared burden of their terrible choice heavy in the digital air between them. "Give the order, Secretary General," Stellan said softly. "Let us begin the illusion." Lenora Quill did not blink. She looked at the men and women of the council, absorbing their fear and their judgment, and then nodded her head once. "Authorization granted. Commander Rook," Quill finalized. "Hold the line. Buy us the time." The transmission cut, leaving the subterranean room in heavy silence, as humanity committed to its first, bloody gamble in the interstellar dark. The hazy, bruised orange atmosphere of Titan hung like a weeping eye against the absolute black of the void. In its imposing shadow, Commander Stellan Rook anchored his vanguard. They were 128 vessels in total, to the naked eye, and certainly to the arrogant sensors of the approaching Empire. They looked like the desperate, final spasm of a dying world. It was an ugly, brutalist patchwork of repurposed frigates, up-armored customs cutters, and retrofitted deep space patrol craft. Against the incoming wall of 240 Tharvex dreadnoughts, it was, by all conventional military metrics, a suicide formation. But Stellan had not come to the orbit of Titan to die in a glorious, symmetrical formation. He had come to turn the empty space into a meat grinder, to bleed the enemy, and above all, to lie to them. Instead of arraying his fleet in the standard, overlapping phalanx that Imperial naval academies taught across the galaxy, he shattered his own lines. He ordered the fleet to completely abandon unit cohesion, dividing his forces into feral, independent pairs, and small, erratic wolf packs. They hid themselves behind the frozen, jagged husks of centuries-old automated mining barges that littered the local space. Engineering crews frantically seeded the local gravity wells with tens of thousands of thermal decoy drones and massive electromagnetic reflector fields, churning the battle space into a thick soup of false signatures and phantom echoes. When the Tharvex armada finally decelerated into optimal weapons range, their opening volley was apocalyptic. Dense columns of emerald antimatter lanced through the dark, vaporizing 3 human frigates in the first 60 seconds. The kinetic shockwaves tossed nearby human vessels like leaves in a hurricane. Aboard the Imperial flagship, the tactical officers reported absolute superiority. The primitive, retrofitted shield arrays of the Earthships were buckling and failing precisely as the Imperial predictive algorithms had calculated. The Empire thought they were simply swatting away the final, brittle shield of humanity. Then, the true nature of Stellan's defense woke up and bared its teeth. The Imperial targeting computers, accustomed to clean, predictable lines and logical fleet movements, suddenly began to choke on the data. As the Tharvex gunners tried to lock onto the surviving human ships, their targeting reticles began to drift wildly across their screens. A perfectly targeted human cruiser would suddenly fracture into 6 identical, burning thermal blooms on the Imperial scopes. The massive reflector fields bounced the Tharvex active scans back at their source, creating phantom armadas that vanished as soon as a heavy volley was fired into the empty space. The clean, mathematical battle space transformed into an agonizing, unpredictable sensor maze. Stellan's tactical doctrine was built entirely on weaponized chaos. Unlike the rigid, top-down hierarchy of the Tharvex fleet, where every flanking maneuver or target shift had to be approved by a sector commander, Stellan had completely cut the leashes off his captains. He gave them broad operational parameters, not step-by-step instructions. This localized autonomy bred lethal, desperate creativity. In one sector, a human captain intentionally vented burning, radioactive plasma from a secondary drive system, perfectly simulating a critical reactor failure. An overeager Tharvex destroyer, hungry for an easy kill, broke its formation to finish the crippled ship off. It dove straight into a dense nest of proximity-fused gravity mines, hidden within the expanding plasma cloud. The resulting localized gravity shear cracked the destroyer's spine in half. Across the battlefield, human pairs used these fake mistakes as genuine traps, turning every erratic human movement into a lethal puzzle. The Imperial command rhythm, built on forcing predictable enemy reactions, shattered into over 100 disjointed, localized, and highly confused skirmishes. The heavily armored alien dreadnoughts were forced to swat at incredibly nimble, isolated threats that refused to fight a traditional broadside engagement. Frustrated by the ghostly sensor readings and the gnawing insect bites of the human wolf packs, a heavy Tharvex strike group commander made a fatal error in judgment. Attempting to bypass the electronic chaos and flank Stellan's center, the alien commander pushed a wedge of massive warships directly through the dense ice and dust rings of Titan itself. It was exactly the mistake Stellan had been waiting for. As the massive, heavily shielded dreadnoughts plowed into the thickest concentration of orbital dust and building-sized ice chunks, human stealth drones quietly slipped into the formation. They detonated pre-planted, deep-core seismic charges embedded in the largest ice boulders. The void erupted in a silent, catastrophic storm. Millions of jagged, hypervelocity ice shards slammed into the Tharvex energy shields. The sheer volume of kinetic impacts overloaded their localized emitters, blinding their optical sensors and stripping their defensive layers down to the bare hull metal. Before the Imperial ships could calculate a reverse thrust vector, human heavy cutters dropped from the upper atmosphere of Titan, utilizing the gas giant's gravity to accelerate to terrifying speeds. They didn't aim for the thickest composite armor. They fired solid, dense tungsten slugs straight into the exposed, temporarily unshielded sensor blisters, weapon mounts, and engine cowlings of the Tharvex heavy cruisers. It was an absolute bloodbath in the ice. Humanity paid a brutal, agonizing price for the maneuver. Human ships burned in the dark. Life pods were vaporized before they could launch, and the screaming of dying crews echoed across the encrypted tactical channels, carving new scars into Stellan's mind. But before Stellan authorized the general, highly controlled retreat, the vanguard achieved the impossible. 19 Tharvex capital ships were left drifting in the dust, their antimatter cores breached, their massive, invincible hulls gutted and dead in the water. The shockwave of that localized defeat ripped through the Imperial command structure. High Marshal Tharvex slammed his armored fist onto his command console, violently halting the Armada's advance. He was forced to issue a full stop, to pull his vanguard back and reorganize his shattered formations. He stared at the tactical plot with mounting, seething fury. This was all entirely wrong. A premature, fractured civilization was supposed to line up its best ships in a doomed heroic stand, or scatter in sheer, uncoordinated terror. They were not supposed to turn the environment into a weapon. They were not supposed to fight like cornered, highly venomous predators. Yet, despite his anger, Tharvex felt a dark, settling satisfaction. The human defense was extremely clever, but it was visibly breaking. They had thrown absolutely everything they had into this desperate trap, and they were still retreating. The primitive humans were bleeding out. Stellan had achieved his true, underlying objective. He had made the enemy commander believe, down to his very marrow, that this battered, fleeing fleet was nearly the entirety of humanity's martial strength. As the human vanguard limped away toward the inner system, leaving trails of debris and vented atmosphere behind them, the Tharvex sensor officers on the flagship began to recalibrate their arrays to pierce the residual jamming fields. As they swept the deep void beyond Saturn's orbit, looking for retreating stragglers to hunt, their instruments caught something that made the bridge crew pause in sudden unease. It was not a military formation. It was a faint, massive anomaly in the background radiation. Deep in the distant, frozen mining corridors of the outer system, where there should have been absolutely nothing but dead rock and empty space, they detected immense, unnatural traffic flows. There were massive gravitational displacements, moving with synchronized purpose in the deep shadows. The thermal signatures were far too large and far too numerous to be the battered human fleet they had just fought. It was the faintest whisper on the edge of the sensors, a terrifying, unspoken hint that behind the bloody curtain of Titan, something infinitely larger and far more dangerous was beginning to operate in the dark. The retreat was an agonizing exercise in bleeding slowly. For 48 hours, Stellan navigated the ragged remnants of his vanguard through the established civilian evacuation corridors. Behind them, the void was thick with the thermal ghosts of their dead, and ahead of them lay the fragile, terrified heart of the inner solar system. Millions of refugees were currently packed into converted freighters and vulnerable transit shuttles, burning desperately toward the heavily fortified orbital lines of Earth and Mars. Stellan's battered flagship, its portside armor entirely sheared off by plasma wash, held the rear guard, acting as a final, bruised shield. The bridge was a cathedral of exhaustion. The adrenaline of the ambush had long since evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating reality of a protracted war. But as Stellan studied the rear-facing sensor sweeps, expecting to see the organized pursuit of the Imperial Armada, his communications officer flagged a stark anomaly. It was not a Tharvex jamming frequency. It was a highly compressed, tightly focused data packet, slipping right through the blind spots of the Imperial sensor net. The signal carried no hostility, only a complex algorithmic knock demanding entry into a secure channel. Stellan authorized the handshake protocol. The central holographic projector flickered, struggling to render the dense alien code, before stabilizing into two distinct, life-sized figures. They were not the conquerors. They were the conquered. On the left stood a tall, angular being encased in a heavy, utilitarian environmental suit. Her skin, visible through the reinforced visor, was a pale, translucent blue, and her four narrow eyes blinked with analytical coldness. This was Vera Knoll. Beside her stood a massive, broad-shouldered entity whose very posture radiated a suppressed, violent energy. His dark, leathery flesh was mapped with ceremonial scarification, though his traditional armor had been stripped away, replaced by the drab, coarse fabric of penal servitude. This was Kale Thren. Neither of them offered a greeting of submission. They did not look at Stellan as a savior. They looked at him with the intense, calculating scrutiny of gamblers evaluating a high-stakes wager. "We monitored the engagement in the outer ice." Kale spoke first, his voice a deep, rumbling vibration that the translation matrix struggled to soften. He was a former officer of a warrior caste, a civilization broken and scattered across a dozen star systems to serve as Imperial shock troops. "You fight with the desperation of a cornered beast. You made them bleed. But drawing a drop of blood from a leviathan is not the same as killing it." "We are buying time," Stellan replied, keeping his tone perfectly level. "And who exactly are we buying it for?" Vera stepped forward, her multi-pupiled eyes locking onto Stellan's projection. She was a systems architect, born to a species enslaved solely for their unparalleled shipbuilding intellect. "You are currently fighting an empire that spans 1,000 worlds. Human. You believe you are alone. You are not. But the chains of the Tharvex are absolute. We do not risk our total annihilation for a fragile hope. We are here to determine if your species is worth dying for." This was the brutal reality of the galactic ecosystem. The subjugated races of the Sagittarius Arm were not waiting for a shining night. They had seen rebellions crushed. They had seen liberators turn into tyrants. Kale leaned closer to the projection lens, his scarred face filling the display. "Every prey species that finally manages to bite the throat of the master eventually seeks to put on the crown. It is the nature of survival. If you intend to defeat the Tharvex only to build a human empire over our bones, we will do nothing. We will let them burn your cradle to ash. We will not trade one collar for another." The word struck Stellan with the force of a physical blow. It was the absolute, unvarnished fear he had buried deep within himself for years. Humanity had spent 7 decades militarizing in the dark, turning its miners into soldiers, its engineers into weapons designers. They had built a war machine of terrifying proportions. But in forging themselves into a weapon sharp enough to pierce an empire, had they lost the very humanity they were trying to protect? Was the long silence protocol just the incubation of a new apex predator? Stellan looked around his bridge, at the exhausted men and women who had just sacrificed their friends to buy a few more days of existence. He looked at the evacuation corridors on the tactical map, representing millions of terrified civilians who just wanted to live without fear. "We did not prepare for war to conquer," Stellan said, his voice dropping to a quiet, iron certainty. "We prepared for war because we refused to be consumed." Vera tilted her head, a gesture of cautious acceptance. "If you speak the truth, then you need a blade capable of striking their heart. The Tharvex dreadnoughts are practically invincible in conventional space, but their faster-than-light jump architecture is rigid. It has a harmonic resonance flaw. I know this because my ancestors designed it under the threat of orbital bombardment." Stellan's tactical mind instantly shifted gears. "A structural weakness during transit. Can you exploit it?" I cannot calculate the exact temporal fractures, Vera admitted, a hint of frustration edging her synthesized voice. The Empire uses biological processors for those calculations. They possess a captive caste of strategic mathematicians, savants capable of predicting multidimensional fold decay. The Empire is currently holding a primary group of them at a localized transit hub, waiting to integrate them into the High Marshal's flagship. Without those savants, the structural flaw is useless to you. A target. A definitive, actionable target that did not involve simply throwing human bodies at a wall of superior firepower. Stellan looked at Kale. The warrior was waiting for the final answer to his question. The moral axis of the entire war rested on this singular moment. Stellan could demand their loyalty. He could promise them protection under a new human coalition. He could lie. Instead, Stellan turned to his communications officer. Lieutenant Rostova, bypass the Unified Earth Council firewall. Take the encryption keys for our secondary tactical network and broadcast them directly into the dark frequencies Vera provided. Unlock our closed communication loop. Rostova hesitated for a fraction of a second, knowing this was an act of high treason against standard operational security. But the look in Stellan's eyes brooked no debate. Her fingers danced across the console, and the secure human network opened its doors to the void. Stellan faced the holographic projection of the two aliens. He did not puff out his chest. He did not offer grand, sweeping declarations of galactic justice. I cannot promise you a utopia, Stellan stated, his words carrying the heavy weight of absolute honesty. I cannot promise that we will survive the next 2 weeks, but I will make you one clear, unbreakable promise. If we win this war, no one has to kneel before us. The crown ends here. Kale Thren stared at the human commander for a long, silent moment. The deep scars on his face seemed to tighten. Vera simply recorded the data burst of the encryption keys, her eyes already scanning the human network architecture. The alien transmission cut out abruptly, leaving the bridge of the human flagship in a suffocating silence. Stellan stood perfectly still, wondering if he had just handed the keys of humanity's defense to a terrified galaxy that would simply turn away. 5 excruciating minutes passed. The hum of the damaged engines was the only sound. Then, Lieutenant Rostova let out a sharp, ragged breath. On the deepest edge of the sensor board, a tiny, emerald ping registered. It was a localized data burst, formatted to the human encryption standard. Then, a second ping appeared, located 3 light minutes away. Then a third. They were incredibly small. They were cautious, brief flashes of connectivity, like fireflies waking up in a midnight forest. A repurposed mining laser flicking a sequence in a distant asteroid belt. A modified distress beacon pulsing a rhythm from a captive fuel depot. A tight beam confirmation from an indentured freighter crew. Stellan watched the tactical map as the pings multiplied. 10, 50, 200. They were not warships. They were the invisible, beaten laborers of a sprawling empire, finally daring to whisper back into the dark. A profound, staggering emotional shift washed over the bridge. The sheer, crushing isolation that had defined humanity's existence for the last century suddenly cracked. Stellan placed his hands on the edge of the holotable, his chest tightening with a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience since the war began. For the first time since the sky tore open, humanity realized they were not going to fight the end of the world entirely alone. High Marshal Tharvex grew tired of chasing phantoms through the outer orbits. Recognizing that the human resistance relied entirely on deception and mobility, he decided to anchor the conflict around a threat they could not ignore. He ordered the vanguard depart, making way for his ultimate instrument of compliance, the Cathedral-class dreadnought, christened the Throne of Cinders, slowly pushed its way to the front of the armada. It was not merely a warship, it was a floating extinction event, spanning over 12 miles from stern to prow. Its heavily armored spine housed a devastating energy lance designed for one specific purpose: to shatter planetary atmospheric shields and boil oceans. Dravik aimed this colossal weapon directly toward the inner system, broadcasting a silent, terrifying message. The time for skirmishes was over. Humanity would either step into the light and fight, or they would watch Earth burn from afar. Stellan Rook knew he could not let that lance fire, but he also knew his battered forces could not survive a direct assault against a cathedral-class vessel. The key to breaking the Empire's iron grip did not lie in matching their firepower, but in blinding their coordination. If humanity could sever the alien armada's ability to calculate synchronized faster-than-light jumps, the Imperial fleet would fragment into isolated, vulnerable clusters. The key to that blindness was held within a heavily guarded Imperial transit hub built onto a captured asteroid, where the Empire imprisoned its caste of strategic mathematicians, leaving the defense of the retreating civilian corridors to his trusted subordinates. Stellan led a daring, highly classified insertion. Commanding a strike team of 20 elite operatives, he utilized the dark network encryption keys provided by Vera Null to slip completely undetected through the outer Imperial sensor nets. The breach of the transit hub was violent, brief, and surgically precise. Within 15 minutes, the human strike team overwhelmed the hub's internal security and secured the captive savants. They were fragile, enlarged cranium beings, physically wired into agonizing neural racks that forced their brains to compute complex fold-decay algorithms for the Tharvex navigators. Cutting them loose from the machines, Stellan's team executed a flawless extraction. For a brief, fleeting moment, the operation felt like a monumental victory. But that victory turned to ash in Stellan's mouth before his stealth shuttle even docked back with his flagship. As he stepped onto the bridge, the tactical holomap was flashing with a catastrophic priority, one distress signal. It was coming from the middle of the main asteroid belt, a region Stellan had meticulously blanketed with layers of false telemetry and sensor ghosts. The Imperial hunter-killer squadrons were supposed to be chasing empty space. Instead, a massive enemy strike force had bypassed every single decoy network and dropped directly on top of a disguised dry dock, hidden deep within a hollowed-out crater. The communication relays screamed as the facility was subjected to merciless orbital bombardment. Dozens of massive, unfinished heavy cruiser hulls were reduced to molten slag in a matter of minutes. But the loss of metal and machinery was irrelevant. The dry dock was the primary staging ground for humanity's reserve flight squadrons. Stellan stood perfectly frozen by the main console as the casualty reports trickled in. 340 pilots were gone. These were not faceless soldiers listed on a logistics manifest. They were the young cadets he had personally trained during his long years of exile in the dark. He remembered their faces. He remembered their eager questions in the briefing rooms, their clumsy first maneuvers in the simulators, and the proud salutes they had given him upon earning their wings. He had taught them how to survive in the void, and he had just unknowingly sent them into a slaughterhouse. Unified Earth Command was thrown into absolute panic and paranoia. The sophisticated decoy networks had not failed due to a system glitch or superior alien technology. The telemetry routing had been deliberately exposed. There was a mole hidden within the highest echelons of the human relay network. Someone with alpha-level clearance had sold the true coordinates to the Tharvex at the exact moment Stellan was occupied with the raid. The enemy knew exactly where to strike to inflict the deepest psychological wound. In the dim, oppressive light of the flagship's war room, Vera Null ignored the frantic radio chatter of the Council and focused entirely on processing the decrypted algorithms extracted from the liberated mathematicians. Her 4 eyes darted across the projected data streams, translating the biological calculations into standard tactical logic. She looked up at Stellan, her voice flat but carrying the weight of a monumental revelation. She explained that the Imperial Armada was entirely dependent on a rigid, localized fold node network to maintain their formation. By utilizing the savants' calculations, humanity could weaponize the deep space gravity beacons they had planted decades ago. If Stellan activated a highly specific sequence of those beacons at the very edge of the solar system, it would create a massive resonance shadow. This would instantly blind the Tharvex fleet's faster-than-light coordination. More importantly, it would create a perfectly stable, undetectable slipstream. It was the exact condition required to safely pull in the massive, hidden forces that the Empire had never seen. However, the physics of the synchronization required immense gravitational anchoring. To create a slipstream large enough, the Imperial Armada, specifically the immense mass of the Throne of Cinders, had to move much deeper into the solar system. They had to cross the orbit of Mars. Stellan stared at the projection, his jaw clenched tight. Letting a cathedral-class dreadnought that close to Earth meant abandoning millions of orbital citizens. It meant sacrificing several major, highly populated defense platforms without a fight. He had to order a retreat that looked entirely authentic. He had to create the absolute illusion that humanity was exhausted, broken, and completely out of options. When Stellan presented the revised tactical withdrawal plan to Secretary General Quill and the Strategic Council via tight beam, the backlash was immediate and visceral. Ministers called him a butcher. They accused him of abandoning the inner colonies to save his own mythical grand strategy, treating human lives as disposable currency. Even those who had supported his initial vanguard tactics recoiled at the sheer scale of the territory he was willing to surrender. Stellan took their hatred in absolute silence. He did not defend himself. He simply issued the mandatory orders to his surviving captains to fall back and cede the Martian sphere. Later, alone in his sparse quarters, the crushing weight of the universe finally pressed down on his chest. The silence of the room was deafening, a sharp contrast to the chaos tearing his species apart. He poured a glass of synthetic ration water and stared at his own reflection in the reinforced window. Seeing the pale, bruised planet floating in the distance, he saw a man who had just traded 340 of his own students for a tactical advantage he wasn't even sure would work. He saw a commander who was deliberately inviting an alien superweapon to point a gun at his homeworld. He closed his eyes, and the phantom screams of the Jupiter Radiance incident merged seamlessly with the fresh, agonizing silence of the destroyed shipyard. He had promised Kale Thren that humanity would not become a monster just to survive. Yet, as he calculated the necessary blood required to spring the final trap, Stellan seriously began to doubt his own soul. He wondered if he was still a guardian protecting his people, or if he was simply turning every man, woman, and child into bleeding pawns for a masterpiece only he could see. For thousands of years, the silence surrounding Saturn had been absolute, a majestic, icy communion between the ringed giant and the void. Occasionally, a human research vessel or a cobalt mining tug would pierce the velvet dark, their thrusters mere fireflies against the planet's gas giant scale. But on this day, the silence wasn't just broken, it was shattered, torn to shreds, and ground into nothingness. Space itself seemed to scream as it rucked and folded. The serene tapestry of stars above the F-ring ripped open, not once, but in a rapid, terrifying cascade of reality-bending detonations. Hundreds of pinpricks of violet light blossomed, expanding into swirling vortices before vomiting forth shapes of nightmare and steel. The great dark void was instantly choked. 240 warships of the Tharvex Empire materialized in tight, predatory formation, their hull plates absorbing the pale sunlight and casting a shadow so vast they obscured the stars, closing off the sky like an approaching wall of iron. They were brutal, predatory designs, all sharp angles, weapon blisters, and engines burning with the sickly green heat of antimatter. Even from millions of miles away, the raw gravitational wake of their displacement shivered through the solar system, registered by every buoy, station, and outpost from Mercury to the Oort cloud. It was an invasion force not meant to conquer a system, but to crush a bug. Before the first panicked report could even be processed by Unified Earth Defense Command, the ultimatum arrived. It didn't come via a polite diplomatic frequency. It slammed into every open channel, broadcast on a tight beam laser that overpowered all civilian and military bands, converting instantly into every dominant human language. The image that flashed onto screens from the high-rises of Manhattan to the biodomes of Mars was one of cold, alien arrogance. High Marshal Tharvex Sorn looked less like a soldier and more like a high priest of destruction. His face, a landscape of pale, scarified flesh. His eyes twin voids beneath a heavy, ornate browpiece. Cattle of Saul, Sorn's voice grated, the translation software struggling with the sheer guttural contempt of his natural tongue. You have existed in the darkness of your own ignorance for long enough. We are the Tharvex, lords of the Sagittarius Arm. Your period of chaotic self-rule is terminated. You have exactly 10 local days to transmit codes of unconditional surrender. You will relinquish all spaceborne assets, surrender control of all planetary resources, and categorize your population for labor assessment. Failure to comply within the allotted 10-day window will result in the immediate systematic kinetic adjustment of your primary inhabited biomes. The choice is yours: serve or become dust. The transmission cut as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the horrifying silence of space and the terrifying reality of those 240 dreadnoughts hanging over the solar system's crown. Then, Earth broke. A collective scream swept across the planet. Global communications media didn't just crash, it went nuclear. The carefully constructed facade of 22nd century stability evaporated in microseconds. Panic, pure and primal, surged through every city. Currencies collapsed on the spot. Governments, previously united under the loose banner of the United Nations, instantly fractured. Deep-seated rivalries, dormant for 50 years, re-emerged as leaders looked to their own defenses. Some emergency cabinets immediately began drafting terms of capitulation, citing the obvious futility of resistance. Others called for suicidal nuclear defiance, while a terrified public scrambled for shelters that didn't exist, forced into the agonizing realization that humanity was not the master of its fate, but merely a non-threatening anomaly that a mature empire had finally decided to correct. Yet, amid the screaming static of a civilization tearing itself apart, the true war had already begun in the silent dark. 70 astronomical units from Saturn, nestled in the eternal twilight of the Kuiper Belt, sat an uncharted speck of dust designated Supply Depot Sentinel-4. To anyone looking, it was an obsolete relic, a refueling stop for deep-range scouts that had been decommissioned 20 years ago. In reality, it was something very different. And Stellan Rook was a very different kind of commander. At 36, Stellan bore the quiet, weary stillness of a man who had already seen his world end once. He was the sole survivor of the infamous Radiance incident above Jupiter a decade prior, where a failure in a civilian ark's shielding had turned thousands into ash while he watched, helpless, from a nearby patrol ship. That failure had burned away his youthful arrogance, leaving behind something harder, sharper, and infinitely more responsible. His face was a map of focused intent, his movements precise as he stood in the dim, red-lit confines of Sentinel-4's clandestine command center. He hadn't been listening to the ultimatum. While the rest of the system panicked over the what, Stellan had been dissecting the how. "Commander," said Lieutenant Eva Rostova, her voice clipped but vibrating with tension. She was feeding the massive amounts of data from the initial Tharvex faster-than-light arrival into their quantum correlation engine. The fleet signature is verified. 240 vessels. Main power cores are off the charts. We have nothing in the inventory that can dent their plating, let alone their energy shields. "I know what they are, Eva," Stellan murmured. His eyes locked on a scrolling waterfall of raw telemetry. "Show me the packet data from their ultimatum transmission. Not the video. The carrier wave metadata." She frowned, her fingers flying over the holographic interface, pulling up the deep layer analysis. Stellan leaned closer. There, hidden deep within the signal noise, was the handshake trace from their initial scanning arrays, a digital fingerprint left behind when they first cataloged the system's frequencies. Stellan stared at the code. His eyes narrowed. "Rostova, look at that timestamp sequence. It doesn't match a long-term surveillance pattern. Run it against the Galactic standard dating algorithm." She did, and her breath caught. "My God. The handshake code is less than 2 standard cycles old. Commander, that means they've only been actively monitoring us for less than 18 months. Stellan pulled back, a cold, hard smile touching his lips for the first time. The terror didn't leave him, but it was joined by a ferocious clarity. The realization hit him like a kinetic round. The Tharvex were arrogant, but they were also negligent. They hadn't done their homework. "They looked at us," Stellan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And they saw exactly what we wanted them to see. They saw the infighting on Earth. They saw our patrol ships, our outdated ion drives, our noisy, inefficient radio communications. They counted our missiles and measured our industrial output, and concluded we are a noisy, primitive species that only recently learned how to leave our own atmosphere. They only see the noisy surface of humanity." He looked up at the command holo, at the horrifying wall of alien warships. "But they don't know about the silence. They have no idea what we've been building in the dark." He tapped the quantum communication link. He didn't have to wait. The channel was already open, waiting for him. Deep beneath Geneva, in a bunker designed to survive a planetary-scale impact, United Nations Secretary-General Lenora Quill looked at the decryption confirmation on her own screen. Her face, usually a masterpiece of diplomatic composure, was pale, but her eyes held the same terrible resolve as Stellan's. Around her, the highest-ranking military minds of Earth were either in despair or shouting arguments for surrender. Quill looked at the decrypted message from Sentinel-4. It was just a single word: confirm. She took a breath that felt like breathing in glass. Humanity had spent 70 years pretending to be weak, pretending to be a non-threat to a galaxy they knew was predatory, all while preparing for this exact moment. The deception had been agonizing, costly, and near absolute. With a precise movement, she reached for a biometric scanner and placed her palm on the cold glass. She looked at her Joint Chiefs. "The time for pretense is over." She spoke a single command: activate the long silence protocol. 7 billion miles away. Stellan Rook felt his console vibrate as a new, high-priority command code flushed red across his display. It was an order he had trained for but hoped would never come. He looked out the small viewport, into the endless black of the Kuiper Belt, knowing his time in the shadows was over. "Lieutenant," he said, turning back to Rostova, "engage the active sensor ghosts. I want every buoy from here to Pluto radiating garbage data. Mask our true signature." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier now that she had orders. "Where are we going?" "We're leaving the belt. We need to meet them," Stellan said. He looked back at the strategic holo, at the overwhelming odds. His mission wasn't to win. Not yet. "Our orders are very specific, Eva. We aren't going in to beat them. Not yet. We have exactly 10 days to put on the performance of our lives. We need to make Dravik Sorn believe that those 240 ships are, indeed, an unstoppable force, and that Earth's pathetic, fractured defense fleet is the very best we have to offer. We have to make them believe what they see." The scene shifted, zooming in across billions of miles of space to the heart of the Tharvex Armada, into the panoramic observation bay of the Throne of Cinders, the Imperial flagship. High Marshal Dravik Sorn stood with his arms crossed over his armored chest, his predatory eyes scanning the pale blue dot far in the distance. Below him, the tactical displays showed a system in freefall. Earth's media was in a chaotic frenzy of terror. Their military was scattering in disorganized retreat. Their governments were bickering. It was all so predictable. It was pathetic. He watched the data streams, seeing the fear of a civilization realizing its end was nigh. He had broken 1,000 worlds like this one. Humanity was just another footnote. He felt the cold pull of contempt, a predatory satisfaction. These primitives would be good for labor, but their spirit would be easy to crush. Dravik smiled with absolute disdain. This would not be a war. It would be a correction. A simple kinetic adjustment to tidy up the Sagittarius arm. Back on Sentinel-4. Stellan Rook watched the strategic displays, seeing the same image of the massive alien armada poised to strike. But he didn't feel the same despair as the rest of his species. He saw the flaws now. He saw their overconfidence. He saw the ticking clock of their ignorance. He only looked at the screen and said softly, to the only other person in the system who understood the terrifying truth. They came sooner than expected. Dravik. But you are still too late to understand us. The broadcasts were relentless, pouring like acid over the collective psyche of the human race. Every hour, civilian networks across the globe painted a picture of absolute, unmitigated disaster. The human defensive line was visibly collapsing. They had lost the outer gas giants. They had lost the asteroid belt. Now, the grim reality of a full-scale rout dominated the screens. Pundits screamed about the end of days. Panic riots consumed 90% of the major metropolitan centers. The carefully cultivated spirit of Earth was not just fracturing, it was turning into fine dust. To the citizens staring at the sky, it seemed their defenders were simply running out of places to die. But in the claustrophobic, humming confines of the battered flagship, Commander Stellan Rook was hunting a different kind of ghost. While his battered fleet bled space to the advancing Tharvex armada, Stellan tore through the encrypted data logs of the relay network. He had isolated the routing path that leaked the coordinates of the hidden dry dock, leading to the deaths of 340 of his own pilots. The digital trail did not point to an elaborate alien cyber intrusion. It pointed to a single, impossible origin deep within his own command structure. It pointed to Silex Mar. Silex was a senior relay specialist, a man who had been there during the very foundation of the Long Silence Protocol over 20 years ago. He was a quiet, brilliant architect of their hidden salvation, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to weaving the invisible communication webs that connected the Outer Rim pilgrim houses. Stellan found him in the auxiliary server room, bathed in the sickly green light of the primary data stacks. Stellan locked the heavy blast door behind him and engaged the local jamming field. There were no blasters drawn. There was no shouting. There was only the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute betrayal. Silex did not look like a spy. He looked utterly exhausted, his hands trembling as they hovered over the console. He slowly turned to face Stellan, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "Why?" Stellan asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the hum of the servers like a physical blade. "They did not pay you. The Tharvex do not negotiate with individuals. You just handed 340 of our own people to the slaughter. You sold the very children you helped hide." "I saved us, Stellan," Silex replied, his voice cracking, thick with unshed tears. "I saved our souls." Stellan took a slow step forward, the sheer weight of his suppressed rage radiating from him. "Explain to me how burning my cadets alive saves a single soul on Earth." "Look at what we built," Silex cried out, gesturing wildly at the encrypted monitors displaying the dormant network of the pilgrim houses. I watched those habitats grow from survival bunkers into hyper-militarized foundries. I saw the casualty projections. I saw the weapon schematics. We built a monster out there in the dark. Stellan, A machine designed only for absolute war. Silex leaned against the server rack, trembling. If we unleash that machine, if we pull the pilgrim houses back to Earth, and we actually manage to crush the Empire, do you really think we will just stop? Do you think the Council will look at the ashes of a galactic superpower and decide to go back to peaceful mining? No. We will take the crown. We will use the pilgrims to conquer. We will become the new empire. I gave them the shipyard so the Tharvex would break our teeth, so they would force a surrender before we become the very monsters we have been hiding from. It was a profound, agonizing confession. Silex had not acted out of greed or malice, but out of a terrifying, prophetic fear of what humanity could become if granted absolute power. He loved his species enough to want them subjugated rather than see them turn into tyrants. Stellan looked at his old friend, feeling a profound, sickening tragedy wash over him. Both men loved humanity deeply. But while Stellan had chosen the agonizing, difficult path of faith, Silex had succumbed to the paralysis of fear. You decided we were already guilty of crimes we have not even committed yet, Stellan said, his tone devoid of any forgiveness. You judged the future, and you paid for your moral high ground with the blood of my pilots. Silex closed his eyes, awaiting the execution he knew was mandatory under wartime protocol. But Stellan did not draw his sidearm. The war could not afford the luxury of simple vengeance. You are going to sit back down at that console, Stellan commanded, his voice turning into cold, unyielding iron. You are going to open a direct, heavily encrypted line to the Tharvex vanguard, and you are going to feed them a lie so perfect that they will bet their entire armada on it. Stellan forced Silex to compile a heavily corrupted version of the Pilgrim House's structural data. He made the traitor transmit a package that painted the massive, outer rim forces not as an organized, apocalyptic war machine, but as a desperate, fragmented collection of broken mining colonies. The data indicated that these outer rim colonies were desperately trying to form a pathetic, doomed militia, but were suffering massive logistical failures and could not possibly assemble in time to defend Earth. Silex wept as his fingers flew across the keyboard. Knowing he was actively sealing the trap he had tried so desperately to prevent, he sent the transmission, weaving it into the dying pulse of a destroyed relay buoy to ensure its authenticity. With the false intelligence planted, Stellan returned to the main bridge. It was time to sell the final act of the illusion. He walked to the central holotable and looked at his command staff. They were battered, exhausted, and running on nothing but combat stimulants and sheer willpower. Abandon the Mars corridor, Stellan ordered loudly, ensuring the command was logged across all fleet channels. All remaining vessels break defensive formations and fall back. We are retreating deep into the Earth-Moon axis. A shocked silence fell over the bridge. Lieutenant Eva Rostova stepped forward, her face pale. Commander, if we give up the Martian orbit, we surrender the last of our strategic depth. It looks like an unconditional retreat. We will be pinned against our own planet with no room to maneuver. It is a retreat, Lieutenant, Stellan replied loudly. Execute the order immediately. Rostova stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a hidden tactic. But Stellan kept his expression entirely blank, playing the part of a broken commander perfectly. The crew turned back to their consoles with hollow eyes, quietly executing the orders, fully believing their leader had finally snapped under the pressure and surrendered the war. Meanwhile, deep in the auxiliary communications bay, Kale Thren watched the human fleet turn its back on the Red Planet. The massive alien warrior understood the savage, beautiful geometry of Stellan's trap. While humanity retreated, drawing the beast inward, Kale keyed his own dark channel transmitter. He did not order a full, suicidal rebellion. That would be a waste of resources. Instead, he sent a highly compressed primer signal to the resistance cells scattered across 24 subjugated star systems. The message was brutally simple. Do not strike the head of the Empire. Prepare to sever the logistical veins. Target the fuel depots. Sabotage the jump gates. Wait in the shadows. And be ready to cut the Tharvex supply lines the second the next signal arrives. Across the void, on the expansive observation deck of the Throne of Cinders, High Marshal Dravik watched the tactical plot update. The tiny, fragile icons representing the human fleet were fleeing from Mars in disorganized clusters, falling back to huddle around their blue cradle. He had also received the intercepted data regarding the pathetic, failing Outer Rim militias. Dravik's scarred face twisted into a deeply satisfied, victorious sneer. The primitive cattle were finally retreating to their pen. They had played their little tactical games. They had hidden behind ice and dust. But they had absolutely no tricks left. They had no hidden reserves capable of making a difference. He ordered the entire armada to push forward, accelerating past the orbit of Mars, eager to bring the planetary lance into firing range and end this pathetic annoyance once and for all. Back on the human flagship, the atmosphere was thick with impending doom. The massive red icons of the Tharvex dreadnoughts crossed the Martian orbit, plunging deep into the gravitational well of the inner system. They were massive, unstoppable, and entirely focused on Earth. The command room was suffocatingly quiet. Every officer expected a desperate final speech, a call to die with honor. Stellan simply looked at the tactical map. He watched the enemy cross the exact gravitational threshold he needed them to cross. He did not yell. He did not offer comfort. He only spoke a single sentence, his voice so completely devoid of fear or warmth that it sent a profound chill down the spines of his entire general staff. Good. Now, let us invite him into the center of the trap. The passage into the Earth-Moon corridor was a descent into a mechanical graveyard. To the billions of terrified souls watching through the synchronized feeds of global observatories, the sky had become a theater of the apocalypse. The broadcast networks had ceased all commentary, leaving only the raw, silent feed of the colossal alien armada blotting out the stars. It was the eve of extinction. Yet, High Marshal Dravik did not find a traditional blockade waiting for him in the cislunar space. Commander Stellan Rook had transformed the gravitational well into a bizarre, jagged labyrinth of orbital decay. The defensive line was not a wall of shining armor, but a dense, chaotic reef of scavenged history. Stellan had ordered the mobilization of every piece of orbital junk within 1,000,000 miles. Massive, discarded solar sails from the early 21st century were unfurled, their highly reflective surfaces creating blinding optical and sensor flares. Thousands of decommissioned, automated rescue drones, previously used for deep space recovery, had been hollowed out and packed with concentrated plasma charges. They drifted silently among the twisted husks of old orbital habitats, indistinguishable from the surrounding debris, until an Imperial cruiser flew too close. The combat that ensued was a grinding, agonizing war of attrition. The human fleet, already battered from the Titan engagement, fought like cornered wolves within this junkyard. Every time the Tharvex gunners managed to shatter what looked like a primary defensive line, the collapsing formation would simply dissolve, only for a new, smaller, and more vicious pocket of resistance to erupt from a different angle. The vacuum around Earth was torn into hundreds of isolated, independent traps. A human frigate would use a derelict communication satellite as cover to fire a single kinetic slug before diving into a cloud of micrometeorites. They were bleeding the Empire, taking down one ship for every 3 they lost. The casualty rates on the human side were catastrophic. Over 60% of the vanguard was already gone. High Marshal Dravik watched this desperate, frantic defense from the command throne of his flagship. He was no longer just insulted. He was genuinely infuriated. This was not war. This was an extermination of vermin hiding in their own filth. The constant, gnawing resistance was slowing his advance to a crawl, making a mockery of his invincible armada. Dravik decided he had tolerated this primitive defiance for long enough. He would not hunt rats in a maze. He would simply burn the maze to the ground. He issued the command that the entire solar system had been dreading. The Throne of Cinders, the massive cathedral-class dreadnought, ceased its forward thrust. Deep within its armored spine, the primary antimatter containment fields began to cycle up. A sickly, blinding emerald light began to pool at the prow of the 12-mile-long vessel, drawing in ambient energy until the space around it actually began to distort. Tharvex was not aiming at the human fleet. He was aiming directly at the North American continent. He would demonstrate the absolute futility of their resistance by turning a hemisphere to glass. If they did not surrender after the first shot, he would simply fire again. On the bridge of the human flagship, alarms screamed in a deafening chorus. Tactical officers shouted that the energy buildup was exceeding all known parameters. This was the moment of ultimate dread. Across Earth, people fell to their knees in the streets, holding their loved ones, watching the green star of their execution brighten in the night sky. The lance fired. It was not a beam of light, but a compressed column of raw, apocalyptic energy that tore the fabric of reality as it crossed the void. It struck the lunar defensive grid first, a network of heavy, planetary-grade energy shields, anchored deep within the crust of the moon, flared into a brilliant, blinding white as they attempted to absorb the impact. For one agonizing second, the shields held. Then, the sheer, overwhelming wattage of the Imperial weapon cracked the network. The lunar shields did not fail completely, but they fractured, allowing a massive percentage of the beam's energy to bleed through. The resulting kinetic shockwave was completely unprecedented. It slammed into the orbital infrastructure ringing Earth. Space stations were instantly pulverized. The shockwave hit the upper atmosphere, igniting the sky in a terrifying, unnatural aurora of burning atmospheric gases. The debris from the shattered orbital platforms rained down like a storm of apocalyptic fire, streaking across the atmosphere in thousands of burning trajectories. To the public, and to the exhausted, bleeding captains of the human fleet, it looked exactly like the end. The sheer visual horror of the burning sky broke the morale of the front line. Comms channels flooded with localized panic. Even Stellan's most trusted commanders stared at their screens in horror, suddenly believing that their cold, calculating leader had finally pushed the gamble too far. They believed Stellan had miscalculated the Empire's willingness to use planetary annihilation right at the start. But Stellan Rook was not looking at the burning sky, nor was he mourning the shattered stations. His eyes were locked on a secondary, highly encrypted tactical display that only he and Vera Knoll could read. He watched the massive icon of the Throne of Cinders and the dense cluster of its heavy escorts shift their positions. To fire that planetary lance, Tharvex had been forced to anchor his flagship against the localized gravitational shear. He had moved his heaviest units into a very specific, perfectly calculated formation to stabilize the recoil of the superweapon. In doing so, the High Marshal had unwittingly maneuvered the absolute bulk of his armada directly into the exact coordinates Stellan had been trying to guide them toward since the war began. 7 distinct, massive gravitational nodes. These were not weapons. They were the final, crucial focal points needed to align the deep space gravity beacons. Tharvex had just provided the immense, localized mass required to complete the hidden resonance network. The gravitational lens, the invisible gateway needed to bridge the outer dark with the inner system, was now perfectly, flawlessly aligned. The trap was not the junkyard. The trap was the shot itself. The command center was dead silent, the crew paralyzed by the sight of the burning atmosphere. Stellan stood up from his command chair. The oppressive weight of his guilt, the agonizing toll of the sacrifices he had ordered, seemed to evaporate, replaced by a terrifying, absolute authority. He turned to his communications officer, his voice cutting through the despair like a thunderclap. "Open every channel. Military, civilian, imperial, broad spectrum, zero encryption. I want my voice on every speaker in the system. The officer, hands shaking, executed the command. A confirmation light flared green. Stellan leaned over the console. He did not speak with the panic of a defeated man, nor the arrogance of a conqueror. He spoke with the cold, absolute certainty of a judge delivering a sentence. High Marshal Dravik. Stellan's voice echoed across the burning void, echoing in the opulent halls of the alien flagship and the terrified bunkers of Earth simultaneously. You wanted to see the absolute limit of humanity. You wanted to know what we are capable of. Stand exactly where you are. High Marshal Dravik listened to the broadcast echoing across his bridge. He let out a harsh, guttural sound that translated into a laugh of pure disdain. To his mind, the human commander was merely acting out a pathetic, theatrical death rattle. A primate thumping its chest while staring down the barrel of a planetary siege weapon. Dravik did not hesitate. He ordered his tactical officers to tighten the blockade sphere, bringing the surviving Imperial cruisers into point-blank range. The central spine of his flagship began to hum with a terrifying new vibration as the antimatter containment fields cycled up for a second shot. This discharge would not just fracture a defensive grid. It was calibrated to ignite the atmosphere and boil the oceans of the blue world below. Deep beneath the surface of that targeted world, the emergency klaxons of the Geneva Vault wailed continuously. The reinforced blast doors were locked, but the command staff knew no amount of rock would save them from a direct planetary lance strike. The Chief of Security grabbed Secretary General Lenora Quill by the arm, urging her toward the deep-crust magnetic levitation train designed to plunge them into a secondary, deeper survival bunker. Quill firmly pulled her arm away. She straightened her jacket and walked back to the central obsidian table. She refused to run. If the planet was going to burn, the leader of humanity would not be found cowering in a hole. She locked her gaze onto the main broadcast camera, transmitting her calm, unwavering presence to the terrified billions huddling in the dark. She tied her own mortal fate to the soil of Earth, cementing an image of civilian leadership so powerful that it silenced the panic in countless shelters. At that exact moment, light years away from the Sol system, the consequences of humanity's defiance began to detonate across the Sagittarius arm. The primer signal, sent by the subjugated warriors, finally bore fruit. It was not a grand, coordinated military assault, but a catastrophic unraveling of the Imperial supply chain. On a toxic, high-gravity world, an entire antimatter refinery mysteriously overloaded, vaporizing the local garrison. A massive, automated transit gate connecting 3 sector capitals was suddenly recalibrated by its captive operators, flinging a vital Imperial supply convoy directly into the heart of a dying star. Millions of indentured engineering castes across 24 worlds simply dropped their heavy tools, severed their communication uplinks, and walked away into the wilderness, instantly plunging planetary power grids into darkness. The logistical veins of the Tharvex Empire began to hemorrhage. However, none of those distant fires could alter the immediate reality of the Earth-Moon corridor. The rebellion of the galaxy was a slow-acting poison, and Stellan Rook needed an antidote right now. Stellan looked out at his tactical projection. What remained of his vanguard could barely be called a fleet. It was a skeleton crew of bruised metal and venting atmosphere. His ships were out of kinetic slugs. Their localized energy shields were practically non-existent, and their drive cores were on the verge of critical meltdown. They were sitting ducks, lined up perfectly before the glowing emerald maw of the enemy flagship. Then, the Imperial sensor officers aboard the alien dreadnought began to shout. Far beyond the orbit of Neptune, out in the absolute freezing dark of the heliopause, the tactical displays suddenly flared blinding white. The dormant, deep space navigation beacons, completely ignored by the Tharvex for weeks, activated in absolute synchronization. The Imperial computers immediately attempted to calculate the mass signatures bleeding through the void, but the targeting algorithms violently crashed. The automated counting systems registered 10,000 spatial displacements, then 50,000, and then the screens simply locked up, overwhelmed by a chaotic, impossible storm of gravitational data. High Marshal Tharvex stepped away from his command throne, his scarred face paling as he stared at the raw telemetry. He looked at the spatial distortion maps, tracking the origin of the massive slipstream. The terrifying epiphany hit him like a physical blow. The spatial tear was anchoring itself directly onto the massive gravitational weight of his own fleet. The 7 nodes he currently occupied were the exact focal points required to stabilize the anomaly. The humans had never been fighting a desperate, failing territorial defense. Every frantic retreat, every sacrificed cruiser, every shattered orbital station had been a meticulously calculated maneuver. They were not defending their planet. They were keeping a doorway open. They were the fragile hinges of a colossal gate. And Stellan Rook had manipulated the High Marshal of the Tharvex Empire into serving as the very weight needed to keep that gate from closing before the appointed hour. Aboard the bleeding human flagship, the crew watched the massive energy spikes on their rear-facing sensors. They knew what was coming from the dark, but they also saw the glowing energy lance of the Imperial Dreadnought preparing to fire. The cavalry was arriving, but the executioner's axe was already falling. The vanguard knew that many of them would be vaporized in the agonizing seconds before the reinforcements could physically cross the distance. Stellan did not offer a grand, inspiring speech. He did not shout hollow slogans about glory or destiny. He simply looked at his exhausted bridge crew, his voice steady and quiet. He ordered all remaining auxiliary power to be diverted to the forward deflectors. He told them to hold their positions. He did not retreat to a reinforced panic room. He stood firmly at the main console, choosing to face the impending fire silently alongside the men and women he had led into the abyss. The climax of the siege arrived without sound. Across the entire visual horizon beyond the sensor edge, the absolute blackness of space began to fracture. The void splintered, tearing open into thousands of faint, glowing trails of faster-than-light displacement. They did not arrive in the orderly, geometric lines of a standard Imperial armada. They ripped into reality like a localized storm of silent lightning, jagged and overwhelming, illuminating the dark with the promise of absolute violence. High Marshal Tharvex opened his mouth to shout a command. He needed to order a counter-barrage, an evasive maneuver, a tactical retreat, anything to regain control of the battle space. But his throat tightened, and the words simply refused to form. As the silent lightning storm engulfed the edge of the solar system, the supreme commander of 1,000 conquered worlds stood perfectly still, realizing for the first time in his life that he had absolutely no idea what to do. The silent lightning tore the fabric of the solar system wide open. From the deep void beyond the planetary orbits, the 11 pilgrim houses translated into local space. It was not a military formation. It was a mobilized civilization. Thousands upon thousands of drive signatures flooded the tactical displays. There were heavy dreadnoughts and nimble strikecraft. Yes, but nestled among them were colossal, city-sized hospital ships glowing with life-saving triage bays. There were massive mobile foundries, their internal furnaces still burning furiously, actively welding armored plating onto half-finished frigates mid-flight. Swarms of automated defense drones poured out of gargantuan carrier holds like angry hornets. The grand secret of the long silence protocol was finally laid bare for the galaxy to witness. Humanity had not simply hidden an army in a secret base. They had exiled a massive portion of their own people to grow up in the unforgiving dark. Now, the children of the void were coming home to defend the cradle. Simultaneously, the flanks of the battle space ruptured. They were not human ships. They were ragged, asymmetrical fleets belonging to the subjugated species of the Sagittarius arm. They did not have the overwhelming numbers of the pilgrim houses, but their timing was absolutely flawless. Guided by Vera Null's decryption and Kale Thren's coordination, these alien rebels dropped out of faster-than-light transit exactly at the Imperial rearguard, instantly locking down every single Tharvex retreat vector and supply corridor. The trap's jaws snapped shut. Stellan Rook did not pause to admire the spectacle. Standing on the bridge of his crippled Vanguard flagship, he slammed his fist onto the primary execution console. He triggered the gravity lens network established during the brutal retreat through the cislunar junkyard. The 7 localized mass shadows generated by the Imperial dreadnoughts were suddenly weaponized against them. The lens activated, unleashing a massive, localized distortion wave that instantly shattered the Tharvex command frequencies. The Imperial Armada, which had operated as a single, terrifying fist for centuries, was violently broken into hundreds of blind, deaf, and disconnected clusters. High Marshal Dravik Sorn was a monster, but he was no coward. Realizing his unified command was gone, he switched to local optical signaling, rallying the dreadnoughts immediately surrounding the Throne of Cinders. He ordered a frantic, suicidal countercharge. The resulting clash was apocalyptic. The Imperial ships fought with the sheer, trapped ferocity of an apex predator, realizing it was about to die. They tore through the outer layers of the Pilgrim Vanguard, exchanging brutal point-blank broadsides that bathed the void in blinding antimatter flares. It was not a clean, easy sweep for humanity. It was a brutal, grinding melee that demanded a heavy toll in blood and metal. Dravik was determined to drag as many humans into the abyss with him as possible. Stellan knew a prolonged slugfest would cost thousands of lives they had just worked so hard to save. He took personal command of a heavy insertion shuttle, launching straight into the chaotic crossfire. Escorted by a squadron of fresh, veteran pilots from the Outer Rim, his shuttle slammed directly into the breached hull of the Throne of Cinders. Stellan and his strike team breached the Imperial Bridge, not with overwhelming firepower, but with localized electromagnetic pulse charges and sheer, unstoppable momentum. The fighting was close, savage, and brief. Stellan stepped over the fallen guards, his sidearm leveled directly at the High Marshal's chest. Dravik stood tall, gripping a heavy plasma blade, his scarred face twisted in defiant rage. Stellan did not shoot. He stared into the alien commander's eyes, reading the profound, terrifying pride masking a total strategic collapse. Stellan lowered his weapon slightly. He spoke with cold, surgical precision, cutting right through Dravik's martial vanity. He told the High Marshal that he could die right here, a meaningless death in a trap he had blindly walked into, ensuring his entire armada burned with him. Or he could power down the core, admit he had been outplayed from the very first second, and allow his crew to live with the shame of their defeat. Stellan pressed the psychological blade deep, telling him that dying in combat was easy, but living as the man who broke the Empire's myth of invincibility took genuine strength. Dravik's hands shook. The silence stretched for an agonizing minute. Then, the plasma blade deactivated and clattered to the deck. The High Marshal yielded. The war ended, not with a bang, but with a galaxy-wide transmission. Standing on the bridge of the conquered alien flagship, Stellan overrode the Imperial communications network. He did not claim the throne. He broadcast a message to the billions of enslaved souls across the Sagittarius Arm. He declared that humanity had not bled to forge new chains. They had fought to shatter the very concept of the right of conquest. The age of empires was over. The proof of their victory did not come from the sight of the surrendered Tharvex dreadnoughts. It came a few moments later, rippling across the open comms channels. The alien fleets that had flanked the enemy, the species who had lived as numbered laborers and nameless shock troops for generations, began to broadcast their identities. For the first time in centuries, they did not use their imperial designations. They spoke their true names, the names of their ancestors, the names of their stolen homeworlds. It was a chorus of resurrected identities, a beautiful, weeping song of freedom echoing through the dark. On the bridge of the Throne of Cinders, a captive Tharvex tactical officer, trembling violently as he looked out the massive viewport at the overwhelming sea of human ships. Finally, broke the silence. He looked at Stellan, his voice a terrified whisper. He asked if this massive, mechanical leviathan that had just crushed the greatest armada in galactic history was the entirety of humanity's strength. Stellan stepped up to the glass. He looked out at the 11 pilgrim houses, at the millions of exiles who had held the line in the absolute dark. He turned his head slightly, his expression utterly unreadable. No, these are just the ones we called back to defend our home. If we have to step further into the dark, the real army is coming right behind them. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.